If your small business has a problem, you could say,
Ugh, just my luck.
but you should say,
like a good neighbor, State Farm is there.
and we'll help get you back in business. Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there.
Need to restock inventory, cover seasonal dips, or manage payroll? OnDeck's small business line of credit provides immediate access to funds, up to $200,000, exactly when your business needs it. With flexible draws, transparent pricing, and full control over repayment, you can tackle unexpected expenses without missing a beat. Apply today at OnDeck.com, and funds could be available as soon as tomorrow. Depending on certain loan attributes, your business loan may be issued by OnDeck or Celtic Bank. OnDeck does not lend in North Dakota. All loans and amounts subject to lender approval.
A warm and friendly hello! Welcome to lovely Las Vegas for Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Hoops Peters, and now part of the VSiN Family podcast. We're actually going to have a one-part conversation today because we did get a lot of news in college basketball over the last 24 hours. We saw a changing of the guard over at St. Joe's. We are going to be diving into that in segment number 1 with Billy Lange stepping down and Steve Donahue now becoming the new coach over at St. Joe's. Feels like we get one or two of these coaching changes every offseason that happen in like September, October. Guy takes a job with a NBA team, a coach does something bad, like we saw the Greg Marshall situation a few years ago. We get like one or two of these every single offseason. This happens to be one. We'll see if we get any more, but want to give you guys my reaction, what we're all going to be getting with St. Joe's. We'll dive into something heavy in a second as well, which is why you're getting this podcast today instead of a WAC Conference Preview Edition. I will dive into that in a second, but that said, we are going to be having a lot of fun there. And then in segment number 2, we're going to talk about St. Joe's. We're going to talk about the Atlantic 10 and some of these mid-majors with a man who has the name mid-major in his name, Mid-Major Matt, aka Matt Josephs. He does a tremendous job over at ESPN Radio in Richmond, the show Border to Border. He's a part of the Prop Queen website as well. We're going to be chatting about the St. Joe's situation and so much more. So we've got a great show for you, and everything is indeed powered by EdgeBoost. EdgeBoost is making sure that bettors are able to have access to their funds whenever and wherever. 100% of gambling transactions with EdgeBoost get approved. You get rewards as you utilize EdgeBoost, and when you go to EdgeBoost.bet, put in that promo code of Greg, GREG. That gets you dollar for dollar match on your first deposit up to $25. And if you ever do have a question, comment, segment idea, what have you for this podcast, have one of two ways to be able to fire those in. First one is my Twitter /X timeline at gunit_D1. Keep in mind letters EM, they mean does not matter. So as per usual, please do send these into the timeline. The other way is via an Apple Podcast review. If you rate this podcast 5 stars, it is very much appreciated. From there, you're able to fire in whatever you'd like to hear on this podcast via that 5-star review. And I was mentioning it before, conference previews are going to be coming your way. You're going to get the WAC Preview Edition tomorrow. I was intending on doing it today. I had it all recorded, but we did see the very sad and unfortunate news, and this is not going to become political discord. I wanted to preface it with that. For those of you guys that have listened to 1 or 2 episodes of Coast to Coast Hoops, or for those that have been with this podcast since, well, the 2018-19 season. I've went 2,100 straight days without a missed podcast, dating all the way back to when it was college basketball overtime on a different network. Well, you know that I don't dive into politics, but Charlie Kirk was shot yesterday on Utah Valley. I did not want to make it look like it was insensitive, for one. Violence is just not the way. Like, let's just call it what it is. You can disagree with someone's politics, way of life. You can disagree with some of the things that are said. List goes on and on. You can disagree with someone. That is fine. The best way, in my opinion, to disagree with someone, like if you think that I am a full of garbage handicapper or a podcaster, the best way to do so is to just not listen to the podcast. Like, if nobody listened to this podcast, I would have no audience. Like, that's the best way in order to be able to take someone down. You don't interact with them whatsoever. But that said, it's just a very, very sad situation. Anyone that is celebrating what happened yesterday on the campus of Utah Valley, shame on you. You are part of the problem. You are not part of the solution. Even if you completely disagree with the guy, he did not deserve what he got. Like, I am not someone that has really political affiliation. You are never going to have politics spewed down your throat on this podcast. But I can tell you right now, there is a humanistic approach with this podcast. Whenever we see like tragic deaths, We wish him absolutely nothing but the best wishes, prayers, what have you. Same thing goes here, but I did not want to make it look insensitive by putting out a conference preview with Utah Valley in there when Charlie Kirk got shot on Utah Valley. That is something that was an executive decision by myself. I think most of you would have seen that there was nothing involved with that, but I just wanted to make sure that it was all safe on the up and up. So you're getting the WAC conference preview edition tomorrow instead of today. Hopefully you understand that, and hopefully best of wishes to Charlie Kirk and his family, because that's just absolutely awful. Nobody deserves to go through life without a father, and that is what happened. So thoughts, prayers with Charlie Kirk, his family, what have you. Again, agree with him, disagree with him, feel somewhat indifferent about him. Same sentiment should be going out there. Now let's get back to basketball. Let's put that on the back burner. Big news out of St. Joe's. Billy Lange, he decides that he is going to be joining the New York Knicks coaching staff, and now it is going to be Steve Donahue who takes over as their head coach. He received a multi-year deal, by the way, and it's one of those things where you just have to make a last-second decision if you're a school like St. Joe's, and it's not like Steve Donahue has had zero success whatsoever. This man at one point was a power conference coach. Now, over at Boston College, things got really bad for him. He actually had a 21-13 record his first season out. Now, he was taking over, if I'm not mistaken, for Al Skinner that first year, and he had a pretty full cupboard, and then he had a bunch of losing seasons from there, and then could just never really get a lot going over at Penn. They made the 2018 NCAA tournament, but post-COVID, things went very much downward from. He was as recently as last year coaching over at Penn. Now it's Fran McCaffrey who's coaching over there, and we all remember what he was able to do in the Ivy League with Cornell, bringing them to a trio of NCAA tournaments, taking them to a Sweet 16. So, he did have a little bit of success over in the Ivy League. He's had success out there in the Northeast part of the country. He's got ties there, and it's not like this is a man that has not coached in 3 or 4 years. He's familiar with the NIL era, albeit it's with Penn, where Penn actually did bring in a few transfers after COVID, what have you. Penn is actually one of the schools out there in the Ivy League that was able to attract a few junior college guys. So this is a little bit of a new landscape for him, since he has been at universities for the most part, other than his 4 years at Boston College, where really were just doing a lot of academics. You were having a lot of guys in there on non-scholarships because the Ivy League just doesn't bring in scholarships. That said, it looks like with St. Joe's, it's going to be an interesting ordeal, because now with the coaching change, that means that players over at St. Joe's do have 30 days to be able to enter in the transfer portal. As of right now, I have not seen anyone enter in the transfer portal. That's something that I will keep you guys abreast of in the next 24, 48 hours. We shall wait and see what is going to be happening on that front. But as of right now, I haven't seen anyone jump ship. I'm sure that there are a few guys that are going to be making their decisions as to whether or not they're going to be doing so, but that does enter into just a little bit of a strange landscape for this program as well, because if they do have a few guys that decide, hey, we don't want to play for Steve Donahue, that is going to be a big loss, and it's going to be very tight for those guys to be able to be eligible right away, because for a lot of schools, classes start right after Labor Day, so that does add a little bit of ball of wax in it as well. So St. Joe should be able to retain a lot of their guys, and I'll be fleshing this out much more when I do my Atlantic 10 Conference Preview Edition, which I'm thinking is probably going to be coming up within the next 7 or so days, because I've got the WAC and the WCC that I'm going to do towards the end of this week, and then I was planning to do the American and the Atlantic 10 within the next, I would say, about 10 or so days, so we'll certainly know a little bit more then when I do that conference preview. But big time news out of St. Joe's, so we shall see what happens there. And Steve Donahue, I think that he's going to be able to do a solid job here with St. Joe's. Billy Lange, I know, was a much maligned coach over at St. Joe's. It felt like he was doing, shall we say, less with more than a lot of other coaches would have been able to do. And we've seen Steve Donahue be able to get a team to the Sweet 16 from a non-power school in the past. So I do think that this is actually not necessarily the world's worst move for St. Joe's. Certainly not a great set of circumstances, but something to where I do think that St. Joe's, they are actually going to be just fine with this. And heck, they might actually be getting an X's and O's upgrade, even if they lose a guy to the transfer portal or two with the just late breaking news that we saw on Wednesday. So that's what we did see there. And we're going to touch a little bit more on St. Joe's. We're going to take a look at the Atlantic 10 and touch on a few other topics on the flip side with our good friend Matt Josephs, aka Mid-Major Matt. Does great work over at ESPN Radio in Richmond. He joins me next on Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Peterson, now a part of the Beast and Family Podcast.
If your small business has a problem, you could say,
Ugh, just test my luck.
But you should say,
Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there.
and we'll help get you back in business. Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there.
And we're back here in lovely Las Vegas for Cuss with myself, Greg Peterson, now part of the VSiN Family Podcast, and it's great to be joined by this man as we've got Matt Josephs aboard. You know him better as Major Matt. He does great work with the radio show Border to Border out there in ESPN Radio in Richmond. Does a great job with the Prop Queen website and the Prop Queen app as well. This time of year doing a lot on the college football and baseball front, but he, much like myself, very much getting set for the upcoming college basketball season, and you're able to follow him on the old Twitter/X at a very fitting college basketball name, Major Matt. And Matt, it's great to get you aboard. Thank you.
Thank you as always. Love talking about this great sport of college basketball.
Yep, and typically you don't find it too much in mid-September where you get a coaching change, but that's what we get, like, I would say once or twice in off-season college basketball with these September/October moves. And just what do you make out of the situation over at St. Joe's with having Billy Lange go to New York, and he's not even really going to be a part of the coaching staff, but he's going to the New York Knicks, and now they hire on a guy, Steve Donahue, who he knows quite a bit about the northeast part of the country, but has never really coached in the Atlantic 10 before.
Yeah, I think this is Billy Lange getting ahead of everybody because I think he realizes he could be in for a rough season, and that rough season would have led to him getting fired from his job. I know he's had a couple of good seasons the last couple of years, but he probably could have been and should have been gone earlier. So I really think he was just trying to get ahead of everybody, looking at his roster, seeing it's a decent roster, but it's probably not one that's going to get him enough wins to keep his job. And yeah, Steve Donahue is a guy that obviously didn't do great at Penn. He had some issues at Penn with regards to that, but that's a whole different recruiting base and everything. And now we kind of wait because the transfer portal opens up for St. Joe for the next 30 days. We'll see how many players leave and where they might go.
Yeah, but I think that it is interesting to look at the landscape of the Atlantic 10 because you know this as well as I do. It always feels like it's a wild, wild west where they try to get multiple teams in the NCAA tournament, but they just sort of vulturize themselves. They sort of just beat up on one another within the conference. And I feel like we might be building up for that once again this year, where we might have a bunch of teams that are like between number 40 and number 60 in terms of like the rankings, but maybe not that surefire top 30, top 35 team that might be able to get the at-large bid to the tournament.
Yeah, I'll be interested to see, obviously, in my backyard, VCU, because, what Phil Martelli Jr. has done early on recruiting-wise, he's brought in several good freshmen, one or two of them for this season and a couple of them for next season as well. He brings over a couple of the kids from Bryant, Keyshawn Mitchell and Barry Evans, who I think will help out. I think there's a lot of athleticism on the VCU team this year. He was able to keep some key players from last year's team. My question will be the shooting. Do they have enough three-point shooting? I think they will. And how will they take to his style early on? Plus, my concern for VCU is they didn't schedule well enough out of conference that they may have to rely on a really good A-10 schedule if they are to make the tournament. Now, look, they might win the tournament in the conference and not have to worry about it, much like they did last year. But I also think if they don't win the conference tournament, they're going to have to get several non-conference victories. And it did not help. And I've questioned this on my radio show several times. I did not understand why they gave Fordham a home and home with VCU, because that's going to kill their net and force them to have to win those games by 20 or 30 points to give them any sort of boost in the net.
Yep, absolutely. And I do think that it's going to be so interesting to take a look at VCU because I think that they are the team that has the best chance of being able to get an at-large bid to the NCAA tournament, but they have a new coach in there as well. And there's quite a bit of turnover with regards to coaches out there in the Atlantic 10. There's turnover with a team as well, with UMass being in the MAC. And how do you take a look at the bottom of the Atlantic 10? Because I feel like over the last few years, these teams like LaSalle, Fordham have really killed the conference, but I actually do feel like it's a little bit of a stronger bottom this year, especially with Fordham, who you just mentioned, hiring on Mike Magpio, where I don't think they're going to be like some sort of top 100 team, but I do feel better about them this year than I did a season ago.
I mean, I guess so. With the schedule that they put together for the non-conference, it was like high school teams and JUCO squads. So, I mean, Fordham's going to rack up the wins in November and December, and I don't know if that's necessarily going to translate to conference play. And then you mentioned LaSalle bringing over the Radford coach, I think was a very good decision. He did some good things at Radford the past couple of years. So, look, at least you get the good coaches in place. Now, it's going to take years for them to shuttle in their players and kind of let the other players have their eligibility expire. But yes, the head coaches in this conference are certainly improving. And look, a team that had been in the bottom for a while, look, for years, I've gone on my radio show and said, George Washington's going to be the sleeper of this conference. And I think once again, I'm going to fall, towards that because I think what Chris Caputo did in the transfer portal was fantastic. He was able to keep some players from last year's team. And I think GW is the sleeper that nobody's really talking talking about in this conference that could be up there with the Daytons and the St. Louis's and the VCUs.
Yep, absolutely. I am very bullish on this George Washington team because unlike a lot of mid-majors, they've got roster retention, and I think that that's going to be so big for them, as Matt Josephs, aka Mid-Major Matt, is joining me on Coast to Coast Hoops, and I think that George Washington has a legitimate case to be a top 3, top 4 team in this conference, with having Rafael Castro back down low, with the fact that they do bring in a guy like a Boo Boo Benjamin who put up some good numbers out in the WAC last season, because with this George Washington team, I thought that they were really derailed by losing Garrett Johnson before the season started last year. Getting him back as well, that's an addition that maybe is a little bit more out of sight, out of mind, because it's not a guy that they added in the portal, but that's a big deal for this George Washington team, who's done a good job in the portal the last few seasons.
Yeah, and this was a program that was really good. As a Temple fan for the longest time, I remember the many trips Temple used to take in the Atlantic 10
The
to
Pops
the Smith Center.
Bonsu days.
Exactly. Igor Mashirikov and all those things. And they used to have the student section with corn pop cereal boxes on their heads and stuff like that. Like, George Washington is a program that I feel like is just kind of like lying in wait a little bit and wanting to be resurrected. So I really like this George Washington team. And then, of course, look, I think, what Tony Skinn does in Fairfax with that George Mason roster, he lost a ton of guys. So I don't know how much I'm expecting, but he brought in a bunch too. When you could bring in a Corey Mincy and a Riley Allensbach and a Dola Adebayo, I think he's a pretty good coach who can do some things with that team. They may have some bumps early, but George Mason could be a team you don't want to play come January and February.
Yep, I think that George Mason did a really good job as well. Tony Skinn, who was a part of that Final Four team, ironically enough, he almost kicked the team out of the NCAA tournament with the move that he made in the CAA conference tournament many, many years ago. Those who know that just story in general, he hit a guy in the private area. That was not great, to say the least, and he got suspended for the first game of the NCAA tournament, but he has done an incredible job with that program as well. And we've been talking a lot about coaches, and we talked a little bit in passing about St. Joe's to start with, but how do you think Steve Donahue might be able to do with the St. Joe's roster? Because with George Washington, I feel relatively bullish about them because they have retention, and now we do need to wait and see if St. Joe's does have some of these guys enter in the portal. But prior to the move of Billy Lange, they did have some of the most returning minutes of any team out there in the Atlantic 10, bringing back Justice Ajabor, bringing back Derek Simpson. I feel like if St. Joe's doesn't have a lot of guys apart in terms of just X's and O's only, Steve Donahue might be a little bit of an upgrade for them. And I feel like St. Joe's, as long as they keep this roster, that's a big if because we don't know at this point, I think that they could be a team that could bust into like that top 5, top 6 of the conference.
Well, I think the offense won't be an issue. It's whether or not they could play some defense. That was sometimes the issue under their previous head coach because there were times where they would score 80 and give up 85, and that just wasn't doing it. Obviously, Deuce Jones is very important. He, like others, it feels like in the Philadelphia area, they go from school to school. So he goes from LaSalle to St. Joe. And then Jaden Glover, who, at St. John's was so highly touted and didn't play as much as maybe we all thought he would. Those are two kids that if you can keep them and keep them with the group that was currently there that they were able to retain, I think this offense is going to be good. I think St. Joe could be an over team if they go back to their old ways of just scoring and running and just not playing defense, but they have to be able to keep these kids in the program. It'll be interesting to see. This is why I would keep a scholarship open if I ran a basketball team just for this sort of situation, because these kids might want someplace to go. And if you have that one spot, it could be a huge addition right before practice begins for the coming season. So what Deuce Jones and Jaden Glover do, I think, is a huge deciding point for this team.
Yep, and then obviously you would have to go into eligibility concerns as well, because I remember back when I was in college, classes would always start right around about Labor Day, so being able to get those guys in, that might be a little bit of a hoop to jump through. So if you do have a scholarship open, it might be a case where they wouldn't be able to play right away, but they'd be eligible for like the second semester, but even that would be a massive boom for one of these teams as well. So there's a lot of intrigue with that regard, and then with regards to the Atlantic 10, I just do take a look at this conference as well, and I feel like the styles of play are going to be so interesting, because with St. Louis, we didn't see them at full force last year. There were a whole bunch of injuries. It was year number 1 under Josh Schertz. I think that they're going to be a whole heck of a lot better this year. And for Dayton, even though they don't have the flash guys from a season ago, they didn't bring in guys like Zed Key, Posh Alexander. Those two guys were big giant flops. And I feel like even though the names aren't as flashy for Dayton, I think that they're going to get back to being the Dayton that we all know and love a little bit more this season.
Yeah, because they always have the great home court advantage. Bringing in the NAC Player of the Year from 2 seasons ago, Jordan Durkat, I think that's huge. huge, and we know that Anthony Grant is a very good coach. We know that what he's going to be able to do is tremendous. And that's why you can never count out St. Bonaventure with Mark Schmidt, because Mark Schmidt is one of the best coaches, and they bring in Woj. And I thought it was very creative that they announced that they're going to do a pro day, which I think, obviously I don't think any of their kids are going to get any looks from the pros, but it gives the program some attention. And now maybe some high school kids are looking at St. Bonaventure, even though it's in the middle of nowhere. Like they're like, well, they're doing things that can help me out for the future. And then look, Drew Joyce, I think, is going to do some good things at Duquesne, bringing back a Maximus Edwards, to bring in a John Hughley, the fourth. I think he's going to be able to do some tremendous things. So I think this is going to be a very fun conference season for this conference. My worry is that they, as you mentioned, cannibalize each other, take each other out. Fordham gets a couple upset wins, brings some teams down, and then we're kind of looking at a lot of NIT and CBI teams.
Yep, absolutely. And one of those teams that was a little bit rough from last year, UMass being out of the fold, I think that helps them out. But I feel like that's actually a win for both of these conferences, because for the MAC, I feel like UMass can step in right away, be a relatively solid team. For a MAC that it just feels like the NIL era has really hurt them. I know that you've been a stan of taking a lot of totals with regards to Toledo over the last few seasons, and I feel like for the Atlantic 10, losing a team like UMass, that helps them if they do want to get perhaps 2 or 3 bids into the NCAA tournament as well.
It's another team much like GW, who their heyday was in the past. Like they were a tremendous team in the Atlantic 10 when they had Travieso and Padilla and Camby and all that stuff. But they just haven't been able to do much in that building. That cavernous building just doesn't look and feel the same when there's not a lot of people in there. So yeah, I think UMass dropping down. Look, there could be some value with UMass to maybe win the conference. And plus, you look at that coaching staff that they have there. I mean, that's a really good coaching staff that I think could find its success in a lower conference. I just wish the A-10 could do the same with Fordham and LaSalle. But hey, listen, one team out at a time, and so maybe those two will be up next.
Yep, absolutely, and that'll be a lot of fun to be taking a look at, because the Atlantic 10 has not had 10 teams in there for quite some time, as we do have our good friend Mid-Major Matt, a.k.a. Matt Josephs, joining me on Coast to Coast Soups, and your name is Mid-Major Matt, so we're a few teams that you might be taking a look at for this year, whether that be in terms of winning the conference, whether that be a little bit more of a game-to-game perspective, because I know that you do a great job of looking at some of these teams in terms of their team totals, in terms of being able to bank on, let's call it what it is, with last year Bellarmine, they're absolutely terrible defense in terms of taking a look at totals. But is there anything that you've been looking at this offseason that you feel like might be really profitable with regards to one or two of these mid-major teams?
Well, I'll say this. I mean, I'll stay in my part of the country. I think JMU is going to become the new Virginia. It's very funny because Virginia was the team in the state that played 60, 54 games and stuff like that. And I think they're going to be an offensive juggernaut this year. I know they're not a mid-major, but you look at this JMU roster and you wonder where the points are going to come from. And I think that their coaching staff is going to instill defense, and I think they're going to play with the kind of pace that Morehead State had for the longest time. And I just wonder if they're just going to have a lot of games that are going to be 60 to 54, and they're going to be like 27-22 at halftime and stuff like that. So I don't know necessarily how good JMU is going to be this season. I think they're not going to be that good, but I also think that they're going to be that team that tries really hard and grinds everything out and really makes you have to work for all the baskets that you're going to get this season. So I think unders, at least early on with JMU, is something that I'm definitely going to look at, and probably their offensive team total unders. I don't know where the points are going to come from with them. And look, I think, Richmond is an interesting team as well. And I know I'm staying to my area, but they're the teams I know the best right now. You bring in a Jaden Daughtry from Indiana State, who is from the area. And, that's a bit of a surprise because he probably could have gone to VCU or any of the other teams in the state. But Jaden Daughtry is instant offense. And Will Johnston, who's been in college basketball for quite a while, coming over from Loyola Marymount, he's another decent shooter. There are some decent returning starters. And much like Fordham, Richmond has scheduled a non-conference schedule that's going to get them a lot of wins early. Maybe that gets them the confidence to upset a few teams and maybe, hover around 500 in this Atlantic 10 season. So I think the Spiders are going to be interesting to watch, especially early on, as they gain confidence from a schedule that's going to get them wins. Now, the problem is they don't get wins from that schedule. What is the roster going to be like, and how happy is everybody going to be? Because they basically scheduled a bunch of games for them to start out like, 9-3, 8-4 entering the conference season.
And I want to expand upon that point a little bit more that you pointed out with James Madison. Do you feel like the Sun Belt might be just an under-conference once again? Because there were only 2 teams in the conference last year that played more than 51.6% of their games to the under. You had 5 different teams hit at least 60% to the under. And with the Sun Belt, you've got a team like South Alabama that essentially dares teams to shoot threes. They had their opponents take over 58% of their shots from 3, and it just feels like nobody in this conference wants to take a lot of threes. And another team that's over by the state state of Virginia, Old Dominion, they're doing it with a lot of big men, and they've been slowing down under Mike Jones too.
Yeah, it's so funny because it used to be where like the Southland was the over conference because everybody seemed to run in the Southland and overs were tremendous and they were, Monday and Tuesday games. I used to play a lot of those, but they've kind of changed as well. But yeah, I think the Sun Belt is an under conference for the most part. And I think it's so funny because you watch basketball at its best and watch them with pace and everything. You watch the Gonzagas and you watch the other teams that run and you're like, that is beautiful basketball. It makes you wonder why some of the teams that go really, really, really slow do that, especially when some of them do have talent. Like there are some teams that are talented in the Sun Belt, but yet they decide to kind of slow everything down and make things more methodical, which, by the way, like that was the problem with UVA for the longest time. They would be the better team against all these squads that they would play, but because there were so few possessions, and if UVA went cold, that would keep their opponent in the game. And then, of course, the Ohios and the other teams that upset them in the NCAA tournament, that is why, because they played so slow. So, yes, I think this is going to be an underconference once again in the college basketball, and I think that JMU could be the leader of that underpack.
Yep, absolutely. With Preston Spradlin, what he was able to do over at Morehead State, we saw what he did in season number 1 over at James Madison, where it felt like they got his style more and more as the season went along. I'm in agreement with you there. And Matt, I know you're doing a tremendous job getting set for the upcoming college basketball season, but still doing great work on the baseball front, doing great work on the college football front, and so much more. So let the good people at home know it's all on tap for you and how people can follow along on social media and other platforms.
Yeah, at Mid-Major Matt on Twitter, certainly, and I post all my plays for all the sports. They're all up there, tracked on the Action Network app, so certainly no one can question the validity of my records and stuff like that. And as you mentioned, I like betting the prop market, whether it's at the NFL or college or Major League Baseball, because I think there's some value in there and team totals and first threes and first fives, and certainly be looking for my new team. Maybe it's Toledo, maybe it's not, who knows? Or maybe it's Bellarmine that we just take the team total over again every single time against them. But certainly trying to find the trends and just playing them, because especially early on in the college basketball season, we know as much as the books do, so there are some things to take advantage if you do your research.
Absolutely. Doing the research here in the summer/fall months really does pay dividends in November and December. And a man that does such a great job of locking in on this great sport is Matt. So big thanks to Mid-Major Matt for joining me right here on Cuz Soups, now part of the VSiN family of podcasts. And if you do like what you're hearing from this fine podcast, Cuz Soups, you're able to subscribe wherever you hear podcasts: Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, and TuneIn. If you have a question, comment, segment idea, what have you for this podcast, you do have one of two ways we'll fire those in. First one is my Twitter/X timeline at @GUnit_81. Keep in mind, Lars EM, maybe does not matter, so as per usual, please do send these into the timeline. And the other way is find an Apple Podcast review. If you rate this podcast 5 stars, it is very much appreciated. And then from there, you're able to fire in whatever you'd like to hear on this podcast via that 5-star review. And I am with you guys every single day on this podcast, regular season and off season. Expect that WAC conference preview to be up within the next 24 to 48 hours. Didn't feel comfortable posting it with everything that happened on Wednesday, but that will still be coming your way. You're still going to get conference previews for every one of these conferences. The WCC is going to be coming up relatively soon, and Lang 10, a conference I talked about quite a bit on the podcast today, that should probably be due up in the next week or so as well. So be on the lookout for that, and I'll be back with you guys once again tomorrow. Thank you.
If your small business has a problem, you could say,
Ugh, just my luck.
but you should say,
Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there.
and we'll help get you back in business. Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there.
Did you know 39% of teen drivers admit to texting while driving? Even scarier, those who text are more likely to speed and run red lights. Shockingly, 94% know it's dangerous, but do it anyway. As a parent, you can't always be in the car, but you can stay connected to their safety with Greenlight Infinity's driving reports. Monitor their driving habits, see if they're using their phone, speeding, and more. These reports provide real data for meaningful conversations about safety. Plus, with weekly updates, you can track their progress over time. Help keep your teens safe. Sign up for Greenlight Infinity at greenlight.com/podcast.